James Mitchell stood in his new corner office on the 42nd floor, surrounded by boxes and the hollow echo of corporate victory. He had orchestrated the acquisition with ruthless precision, and now this glass-walled kingdom was his. While moving a heavy filing cabinet, something fluttered to the floor. A piece of paper worn soft at the edges. He picked it up. A child's crayon drawing. Crude stick figures under a rainbow. On the back, a note from a custodian named Robert Chen, thanking the previous executive for letting his sick daughter Emma draw here during late-night shifts. James would later learn that Emma had died 5 months ago, and that Robert was among the hundreds he had just laid off. What he could not know, standing there with that simple drawing in his hands, was that this moment would shatter the walls he had built around his heart and change both their lives forever. James Mitchell was 42 years old, worth $300 million, and felt absolutely nothing. The corner office stretched before him like a monument to ambition, all glass and steel and leather, perched on the 42nd floor where the city below looked like a collection of toy buildings inhabited by toy people. He had orchestrated the acquisition of Hartwell Industries with the precision of a surgeon and the coldness of an executioner, slashing budgets and eliminating redundancies until the company's stock price soared and the board applauded his ruthlessness. 273 people had lost their jobs in the process, their positions deemed unnecessary, their departments consolidated, and their years of service reduced to lines on a spreadsheet that James had approved without hesitation. Now he stood in what should have been the culmination of everything he had worked toward, and he felt nothing at all. His assistant, a nervous young woman named Caroline, had helped him carry up the last of the boxes, mentioning with an uncomfortable laugh that the previous CEO, Richard Harrison, had left in quite a hurry, as if the walls themselves had become unbearable. James had simply nodded, dismissing her with a wave of his hand, preferring solitude to the effort of small talk. The office was a cathedral of corporate success, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view that lesser executives would have killed for mahogany desk the size of a small car, the leather chairs that cost more than most people made in a month. But to James, it was just another room. Just another milestone on a journey that had lost all meaning 3 years ago when cancer had taken his wife Sarah from him. He had buried his grief in balance sheets and profit margins, transformed his pain into an engine of relentless ambition, becoming the kind of man who could make impossible decisions without flinching because he had already survived the one thing that could truly destroy him. Or so he told himself. Now, surrounded by cardboard boxes and expensive furniture, James Mitchell realized that his victory tasted like ashes, and the silence in his new kingdom was deafening. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. James began the tedious work of unpacking, arranging his personal effects in a space that still smelled of someone else's cologne and old decisions. He positioned his laptop on the massive desk, placed a single-framed photograph of Sarah in the corner where he could see it without having to look at it directly, and started moving furniture to suit his preferences. The filing cabinet was heavy, old-fashioned metal that belonged to a different era of business, and as he pushed it aside to make room for a more modern bookshelf, he heard something flutter behind it, a whisper of paper against wood. Curious despite himself, James reached into the narrow gap between cabinet and wall, his fingers brushing against dust and something else. Something wedged there as if hidden or forgotten. He pulled out a piece of paper, folded once and worn soft at the edges like cloth. The kind of wear that comes from being handled with care over time. Unfolding it carefully, James found himself looking at a child's crayon drawing, the kind of artwork that adorned refrigerators in homes where children still lived and laughter still echoed through hallways. The drawing was simple but earnest, stick figures holding hands under a rainbow that arched across the page in waxy stripes of color, purple and blue and red and yellow, applied with the heavy-handed enthusiasm of small fingers. Above the figures, crude letters spelled out, "Thank you" in uneven capitals, some backward, some floating at odd angles. James almost smiled at the innocence of it, almost threw it away as he had thrown away so many unnecessary things. But something made him pause. He turned the paper over and found handwriting on the back. Adult handwriting. Careful and neat, despite being written on the reverse side of crayon wax. The note was brief, dated 8 months prior, addressed to Mr. Harrison. It read, "Thank you for your kindness in letting Emma draw in your office during my late shifts. These moments of normalcy mean everything to us during such dark times. Your compassion will never be forgotten. With deepest gratitude, Robert Chen." Custodial Services. James stood very still, the drawing trembling slightly in his hands, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt something crack in the armor he had built around his heart. James read the note again, slowly this time, letting each word sink in like stones dropping into still water. The phrase "dark times" hung in the air, heavy with implication, and he understood instinctively what Robert Chen had been too polite or too private to spell out explicitly. Emma had been sick, perhaps seriously so. And in the fluorescent-lit hours after midnight, when her father pushed a cleaning cart through empty offices, she had been allowed to sit and draw while he worked, finding small moments of happiness in crayon and paper. The date on the note told him this had happened 8 months ago, which meant Emma would have been around 7 years old, the age when children still believed in rainbows and stick-figure families could represent something pure and uncomplicated. Robert's gratitude was palpable even in those few carefully chosen words, thanking Harrison for kindness during dark times, for compassion that would never be forgotten, and James felt something he had not experienced in so long he almost did not recognize it. A tug at his heart, a pulling sensation behind his ribs as if something frozen there had begun to thaw. He looked at the drawing again and saw it differently now. Not as childish scribbling, but as a testament to hope in the face of suffering, each crayon stroke a small act of defiance against whatever darkness had been closing in on that little girl. He noticed details he had missed before. A small heart drawn near one of the stick figures, probably meant to represent love or gratitude or simply the fact that Emma Chen, at 7 years old and sick enough to need her father close during late-night hours, still believed the world was worth decorating with rainbows. James set the drawing carefully on his desk, smoothing out the creases with fingers that had signed termination papers without trembling, and found that he could not stop looking at it. The stick figures seemed to watch him with their circle eyes and crayon smiles, and for the first time since Sarah died, James Mitchell made a decision that had nothing to do with profit margins or shareholder value. He needed to find out what had happened to Emma Chen and her father Robert. He needed to know if that darkness had lifted or if it had consumed them both, and he needed to know it right now. James called Human Resources first thing the next morning, before his assistant arrived, before the emails started flooding in, before the machine of corporate leadership could demand his attention. The HR director, a woman named Patricia Winters, who had survived the acquisition by being ruthlessly efficient, answered on the second ring with the crisp professionalism of someone who had learned to anticipate problems. James asked about Robert Chen, custodian, and there was a pause on the other end of the line. The kind of silence that speaks volumes before a single word is uttered. Patricia cleared her throat, her voice suddenly careful, deliberately neutral, and reluctantly revealed that Robert Chen had been laid off 3 weeks ago during the restructuring. Standard procedure during acquisitions of this magnitude. Nothing personal, simply a matter of consolidating the custodial services with a contracted company that could provide the same work at a lower cost. James felt a knot form in his stomach, a physical manifestation of something he refused to name because he had signed off on that exact decision, had approved the custodial department cuts without reading the names, without considering that each line item represented a human being with a life and a story, and possibly a sick daughter who drew pictures of rainbows. He asked about Emma, the daughter, trying to keep his voice steady. And there was another pause, longer this time, before Patricia admitted that she did not have that information, that employee dependents were not tracked beyond insurance records. And those files had been archived when the layoffs occurred. James requested Robert's last known contact information, his voice carrying the tone of command that made assistants scramble and executives straighten their spines. And Patricia complied immediately, emailing him an address in a neighborhood James had never visited, and a phone number that she warned apologetically, had been disconnected for non-payment 2 weeks prior. James thanked her and ended the call, then sat at his enormous desk staring at Emma's drawing, which he had brought with him that morning in a folder, as if it were a precious document requiring protection. He tried to focus on the quarterly reports waiting for his review, tried to immerse himself in conference calls about market projections and strategic initiatives, but his eyes kept drifting back to those stick figures holding hands under their crayon rainbow. And for the first time in his professional life, James Mitchell could not concentrate on his work because all he could think about was a custodian named Robert Chen and what had become of his daughter Emma. That evening, James did something entirely out of character, something his assistant would have marked on the calendar as unprecedented. He left the office at 5 o'clock, walking past startled executives who were accustomed to seeing his light burning long after midnight, ignoring the stack of documents that still required his signature, and drove his $70,000 sedan to an address in a part of the city he had only ever seen from the highway. The neighborhood was modest in the way that word is used to soften the reality of struggling, older apartment buildings with cracked facades and air conditioning units jutting from windows like mechanical barnacles, children's toys scattered on patchy lawns, cars that had seen better decades parked along streets where the asphalt bore the scars of countless winters. James felt absurdly out of place in his tailored suit and Italian leather shoes, his car drawing stares from residents sitting on stoops in the cooling evening air, and he realized with uncomfortable clarity that he had insulated himself so thoroughly from ordinary life that he had forgotten what most of the world actually looked like. He found the apartment building, a 3-story structure with paint peeling from the window frames, and climbed the stairs slowly, his hand on a railing that wobbled under his grip. The third-floor hallway smelled of cooking, curry, and garlic, and something fried, mixed with the musty scent of old carpet that had absorbed decades of life and struggle. James found apartment 312 and knocked, his knuckles rapping against a door that had been painted over so many times the wood grain had disappeared beneath layers of institutional beige. No answer came, just the muffled sound of a television playing somewhere deeper in the building, and a baby crying behind another door. He knocked again, harder this time, and waited while his heart beat with an urgency he did not fully understand. Still nothing. Just silence from within. And James was about to turn away when a door opened down the hall and an elderly woman peered out, her face lined with the kind of wisdom that comes from witnessing too much. She looked at him with open curiosity, taking in his expensive clothes and the uncertainty in his posture, and asked in a voice rough from years of cigarettes if he was looking for Robert. The elderly woman studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing with recognition, and James realized with a sinking feeling that she knew exactly who he was. She introduced herself as Mrs. Patterson and said she had seen his photograph in the newspaper articles about the acquisition, the business section celebrating his ruthless efficiency while the local news mourned the jobs lost in the process. Her tone was cold, protective, the voice of someone who had watched her neighbors struggle and learned to be suspicious of men in expensive suits bearing questions. James swallowed his pride and explained simply that he had found a drawing made by Emma Chen, that he wanted to return something to Robert, to speak with him if possible. And he watched as Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted like clouds parting to reveal unexpected sunlight. She stepped back from her doorway and invited him in with obvious reluctance, gesturing to a small apartment filled with crocheted blankets and photographs of grandchildren, offering him tea that he accepted because refusing would have been an insult. She told him about Robert Chen as she poured hot water over tea bags in chipped mugs, describing a good man, the kind of devoted father you rarely saw anymore, someone who worked doubles and triples to provide for his little girl. Emma had leukemia, diagnosed when she was just 5 years old, and she had fought with the fierce courage of children who do not yet understand that they are supposed to be afraid, enduring 2 years of chemotherapy and hospital stays and brief, precious remissions that never lasted long enough. She passed away 5 months ago, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice dropping to a whisper as if the walls still mourned, and Robert was devastated in a way that hollowed him out from the inside, but he kept working because the medical bills were staggering, mountains of debt that buried him even as he tried to honor his daughter's memory by surviving. Then the layoffs came. Mrs. Patterson continued, her eyes fixed on James with an accusation she did not need to speak aloud. And Robert lost the job that had been his lifeline. He moved out last week, she said, unable to afford the rent any longer. And she did not know where he had gone, only that he had loaded his few possessions into an old car and driven away without saying goodbye. James sat in her threadbare armchair holding his untouched tea, and the guilt that crashed over him was so crushing he could barely breathe. James returned to his car and sat in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. Emma's drawing lay on the passenger seat where he had placed it that morning, the stick figures seeming to mock him with their innocent happiness, their crayon optimism. He thought about the layoffs, about the spreadsheets he had reviewed with clinical detachment, rows and columns of data that represented overhead costs and efficiency metrics and shareholder value. Robert Chen had been just a number to him. Employee number 247 in the custodial department. A line item that could be eliminated with a keystroke and a signature, and James had never once thought about the face behind that number. The man who came to work each night carrying the weight of a dying daughter and mountains of medical debt. He had never considered that his ruthless efficiency, the very quality that had made him successful and wealthy and powerful, could destroy someone who was already broken, could take a grieving father barely holding himself together and strip away the last thing keeping him upright. The realization hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his vision blur. He thought about his own loss, about Sarah and the cancer that had consumed her, about the grief he had buried so deeply he convinced himself it no longer existed, and he saw his reflection in Robert Chen and saw two men drowning in loss. Except James had money and power to keep himself afloat, while Robert had nothing but an old car and the memory of a daughter who drew rainbows. James pulled out his phone with shaking hands and called his head of security, a former detective named Marcus, who handled delicate matters with discretion. He asked Marcus to find Robert Chen, to use whatever resources were necessary to leave no stone unturned. And when Marcus asked about the budget for such a search, James said 5 words that surprised them both: "I don't care what it costs." He ended the call and sat in the gathering darkness, watching lights come on in apartment windows, where families gathered for dinner and children did homework. And life continued in all its messy, beautiful ordinariness. That night, James took Emma's drawing home for the first time, and he placed it on his desk in his empty house, where Sarah's presence still haunted every room, and he stared at it until the early hours of morning, unable to sleep, unable to escape the weight of what he had done. 3 days passed like a slow descent into consciousness, each hour marked by James's inability to focus on anything beyond Emma's drawing, which he had hung in his home office where he could see it from every angle. He would find himself staring at it during conference calls, losing the thread of conversation as his mind drifted to a little girl he had never met and a father he had destroyed without knowing. On the 3rd day, Marcus called just as the sun was setting, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a job completed, and he reported that he had found Robert Chen. He was living in his car, an old sedan with nearly 200,000 miles on it, parking behind St. Mary's Church in a neighboring town where the priest turned a blind eye to those who had nowhere else to go. Robert was working odd cash jobs, day labor at construction sites, washing dishes at a diner that paid under the table, doing whatever he could to survive while sleeping in a vehicle that should have been retired years ago. James did not hesitate, did not thank Marcus or ask for more details, simply grabbed his keys and Emma's drawing and drove into the gathering darkness with a single-minded purpose that felt almost like prayer. The church was 40 minutes away, a small structure with a white steeple that gleamed under a streetlight, and behind it James found a parking lot empty except for one old sedan with condensation on the windows. He could see a figure in the back seat, someone curled up under what looked like a thin blanket. And James realized he was looking at Robert Chen, a man who had fallen so far that sleeping in a car behind a church constituted shelter. James sat in his own vehicle with the engine running, the heat keeping him comfortable, while 20 feet away, a man shivered in the cold, and for the first time in his calculated, efficient life, James Mitchell had absolutely no idea what to do. What could he possibly say to this man? How did you apologize for being the architect of someone's destruction? How did you stand before a grieving father whose last foothold on stability you had casually eliminated and explain that you had found his dead daughter's drawing and it had somehow cracked open your heart? The questions circled in his mind like birds of prey. And James sat frozen in the darkness, watching the condensation on Robert Chen's windows, paralyzed by the enormous weight of his own guilt. James forced himself out of the car, his legs unsteady beneath him, and walked across the cold asphalt toward the sedan that held a man whose life he had helped destroy. He tapped gently on the window, barely more than a brush of his knuckles against glass, and watched as the figure inside jerked awake with the startled reflex of someone who had learned to sleep with one eye open. Robert Chen sat up quickly, defensive and wary, and even through the condensation, James could see he was in his late 30s, but looked a decade older, worn down by grief and hardship, until his face carried lines that should have come much later in life. The window came down slowly, manually cranked, and Robert stared at him with growing recognition, his eyes widening as he placed James's face from company meetings and newspaper photographs. His expression hardened into something like bitter acceptance, and he asked in a voice rough from cold and exhaustion if James had come to finish the job, as if there was anything left to take from a man who was already sleeping in his car. James said nothing, simply held up Emma's drawing, and he watched as Robert's entire expression crumbled, like a building whose foundation had given way. Robert scrambled out of the car, nearly falling in his haste, his breath coming in visible clouds in the night air as he stared at the paper in James's hands. His hands shook as he reached for it, trembling so badly he could barely grasp it, and when his fingers finally closed around the edges of that crayon drawing, he made a sound that was half sob and half gasp. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice breaking on every word. And James explained simply and honestly that it had been wedged behind a filing cabinet in the office, that he had only discovered it days ago, that he had been searching for Robert ever since. Robert was not listening. Not really, because he had pulled the drawing to his chest and was clutching it like a drowning man clutches a lifeline, and tears were streaming down his face as he stood there in a church parking lot at night, reunited with a piece of his daughter he thought was lost forever, facing the man who had taken everything else away. They sat on the church steps, two men separated by wealth and circumstance, but united by grief, and they talked as the night deepened around them, and the stars emerged from behind the city's glow. Robert told Emma's story in a voice that wavered but never quite broke, describing a little girl who was diagnosed with leukemia at 5 years old and fought with a courage that shamed every adult who witnessed it. She endured chemotherapy that made her tiny body rebel, hospital stays that stretched into weeks, procedures that would have broken grown men, and through it all she smiled whenever anyone asked how she was doing because she did not want the people she loved to worry about her. The previous CEO, Richard Harrison, had been kind in a way that Robert still struggled to comprehend, letting Robert bring Emma to the office during night shifts when she could not sleep, when the insomnia that came with her medication made staying home impossible. She would draw while Robert cleaned, spreading out her crayons and paper on Harrison's desk, and Harrison would talk to her about her pictures, would ask her about the stories behind each drawing, would give her expensive art supplies from the office store, and tell her she was the best artist he had ever met. He made her feel normal, Robert said, his voice thick with gratitude and loss, made her feel like she was just a regular kid creating art instead of a sick child waiting in an office because her father had nowhere else to take her. Emma drew that picture the week before she died, during one of her last good days when the pain was manageable and her hands were steady enough to hold the crayons. She wanted to thank Harrison for being kind, for treating her like she mattered, for giving her father a place where she could be a child instead of a patient. Robert left the drawing on Harrison's desk the night of Emma's last hospital admission. A small gesture of appreciation that felt inadequate, but was all he had to offer. Then weeks later, after the funeral that Robert barely remembered through the fog of grief, after he had buried his only child and returned to work because the medical bills demanded it, the layoffs came. Robert lost everything in the span of 5 months. His daughter, his job, his home, his reason for getting up in the morning, and as he sat on those cold church steps clutching Emma's drawing, he whispered the truth that had been destroying him slowly from the inside. "I have nothing left." James listened to every word, and as Robert spoke, his own grief surfaced like something buried rising from deep water, inevitable and unstoppable. He told Robert about his wife Sarah, about the cancer that had taken her 3 years ago, about how he had watched the strongest person he knew become frail and frightened, and finally still. He described how he had buried himself in work to avoid feeling anything, how he had transformed his pain into ambition, and his loss into a weapon of ruthless efficiency, becoming the kind of man who could make impossible decisions without flinching, because he had already survived the one thing he thought could destroy him. "I forgot that numbers are people," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. And the admission felt like confession, like finally speaking a truth he had been avoiding since the moment he signed those termination papers. He admitted that he was responsible for Robert's layoff, that he had approved the custodial department cuts without reading the names or considering the lives behind them, and he did not make excuses or hide behind corporate language about efficiency and necessity. He owned it completely, sitting there on cold stone steps behind a church, and the weight of that ownership was almost unbearable. Robert was silent for a long time. So long that James thought perhaps there was nothing more to say, no bridge that could span the distance between them. Finally, Robert spoke, his voice carrying something between disbelief and exhausted curiosity. "You came all this way to tell me that?" James met his eyes and said simply that he had come to ask what he could do to make it right, knowing even as he spoke that the question was inadequate, that nothing he could offer would truly balance the scales. Robert looked down at Emma's drawing, at the stick figures holding hands under their rainbow, and his response was quiet but devastating. "You cannot bring her back. You cannot undo what is done." "No," James agreed, feeling the truth of those words settle in his chest like stones. "But I can try to honor her memory." The words hung in the cold air between them. An offer that was simultaneously everything and nothing. And James waited to see if Robert Chen would accept it or tell him to go away and never come back. James made his offer carefully, choosing each word as if diffusing a bomb, explaining that he wanted to provide full reinstatement at the company. Back pay for the weeks Robert had been without work, full benefits, including health insurance that Robert desperately needed even though Emma was gone. Robert listened with an expression that cycled through disbelief, skepticism, and something darker. His pride wounded by the suggestion that he need juju. "I do not want charity," he said, his voice harder now, defensive in the way people become when they have been stripped of everything except their dignity. James shook his head firmly and replied that it was not charity, that it was what should have happened in the first place. What would have happened if James had been paying attention to people instead of numbers? Robert's jaw tightened and he asked the question that mattered most, his eyes searching James's face for deception or pity or whatever ulterior motive surely lurked beneath this sudden generosity. "Why do you care now?" James looked at Emma's drawing, still clutched in Robert's hands, and gave the only honest answer he had. "Because your daughter drew a picture of hope when she was dying, and I have forgotten what hope looks like." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the wind moving through bare tree branches. James continued before his courage failed, explaining that he was offering more than just a job, that he wanted to help Robert get back on his feet completely, find him a place to live, give him time to grieve properly without the crushing pressure of survival, making every moment unbearable. "Let me do this," James said, and his voice carried a plea he had not intended. "Not for me, for Emma." Robert stared at the drawing, at his daughter's stick figures and their rainbow, and something in him finally cracked, the resistance that had been holding him upright, suddenly giving way under the weight of exhaustion and loss, and the terrible relief of not having to fight alone anymore. He was broken and tired, and so very done with pretending he could survive this on his own, and when he finally nodded, it was barely perceptible. But it was enough. Weeks passed and James threw himself into helping Robert with the same intensity he had once reserved for hostile takeovers. But this time the goal was construction rather than destruction. Robert was rehired immediately. Not as a custodian, but as a facilities supervisor with a salary that would allow him to rebuild his life with dignity intact. James personally helped him find an apartment, not in the building where Mrs. Patterson lived, but in a newer complex with good light and a small balcony, a place where Robert could start fresh without every corner reminding him of what he had lost. But somewhere in the process of practical assistance, something unexpected happened between them. A friendship that neither man had anticipated or sought, but that grew naturally from shared grief and mutual understanding. James found himself visiting Robert's new apartment on weekends, helping him assemble furniture and hang pictures, and Robert showed him photographs of Emma that James studied with the reverence they deserved, seeing in that little girl's smile something that reminded him of joy he thought was gone forever. They shared meals at Robert's small dining table, take-out Chinese food and grocery store pizza, and they talked about loss and grief with the honesty of two people who had both stared into the abyss and survived. James established a foundation in Emma's name, the Emma Chen Memorial Fund for families dealing with childhood illness, providing financial assistance for medical bills and emotional support for parents navigating the nightmare of sick children. He funded it personally with an amount that would have bought another vacation home or luxury car, but instead would help dozens of families avoid the financial destruction that had contributed to Robert's downfall. The company culture began to shift under James's new leadership, subtle changes at first, but growing more pronounced as he implemented policies that considered employees as people rather than numbers on spreadsheets, providing better health care, more flexible scheduling for parents, mental health resources for those dealing with loss. Word spread through the corporate corridors about what the CEO had done for Robert Chen, the custodian he had personally sought out and restored, and employees who had been bracing for more cuts began to see their leader differently. Began to believe that maybe this company valued them as human beings after all. 6 months later, the Emma Chen Memorial Foundation held its first fundraiser in a hotel ballroom filled with people who had heard the story and wanted to be part of something that transformed tragedy into hope. Robert stood at a podium wearing a suit that James had helped him pick out, and he spoke about his daughter with a clarity that came from having traveled through the darkest part of grief and emerged on the other side. He described Emma's courage, how she had faced her illness with a smile that never quite faded even when the pain was overwhelming. And he talked about her kindness, how she had drawn pictures for the nurses who cared for her and made thank you cards for doctors who worked to save her life. James sat in the audience with tears streaming down his face, not caring who saw, not caring that a CEO was supposed to maintain composure and control, because some moments demanded tears, and this was one of them. After the speeches and the applause and the pledges of support that would help dozens of families, Robert approached James with an expression of profound gratitude. He thanked him, genuinely and without reservation, and said words that James would remember for the rest of his life. "You gave me a reason to keep going." James shook his head and replied with equal honesty that Robert had reminded him why he should, that finding Emma's drawing had cracked open a heart he thought was permanently sealed. They stood together before a large portrait of Emma that dominated one wall, her bright smile captured in a photograph taken during one of her good days, and beside it hung the original drawing in a simple frame, those stick figures and their rainbow preserved behind glass like the precious artifact it was. James looked at the drawing and said quietly that Emma had saved both of them. And Robert nodded because he understood the truth of it, understood that his daughter's small act of gratitude had set in motion a chain of events that had pulled 2 drowning men back to shore. They had both found a way forward. Not together in any conventional sense, but parallel to each other, 2 lives irrevocably changed by loss and then transformed by the decision to honor that loss rather than let it destroy them. They were not replacing what had been taken. Sarah and Emma would always be gone. But they were building something in memory of them, something that would outlast grief and give meaning to suffering. 1 year had passed since James Mitchell found a child's drawing behind a filing cabinet, and his office on the 42nd floor looked entirely different now, warmer somehow despite the same glass walls and city views, filled with photographs of foundation events and thank you cards from families they had helped, and in the place of honor on his desk sat Emma's drawing in its simple frame. A daily reminder of what truly mattered. The company was thriving under his compassionate leadership. Profits up not because he had cut deeper, but because employees who felt valued worked harder and stayed longer, and Robert Chen had become one of his closest advisors, helping James understand the human cost of every decision before it was made. Together, they had helped dozens of families through the foundation, providing financial assistance and emotional support to parents navigating the nightmare of childhood illness, and each family represented a life that would not be destroyed the way Robert's nearly was. James stood at his window looking out at the city, at millions of people living their invisible struggles, and he reflected on how one simple drawing had changed everything, had cracked open his heart, and reminded him that behind every number on a spreadsheet was a human being with a story worth hearing. And now, dear viewer, let us step back from this story and recognize the profound truth it contains. We never know the ripples we create with our actions. Never understand how a small kindness might save someone who is drowning, or how casual cruelty might destroy someone already broken. Richard Harrison let a sick child draw in his office during late-night shifts, a gesture he probably forgot by morning, but that simple act of compassion created a legacy that would help hundreds of families and transform a man who had forgotten his own humanity. Loss can lead to purpose if we let it, if we choose to honor what we have lost by becoming better versions of ourselves, by ensuring that suffering creates meaning rather than just more suffering. Our humanity is not measured by our success, our wealth, our titles, or our power, but by how we treat those who can do nothing for us, and people we encounter when no one is watching, and there is no reward except the knowledge that we chose kindness over indifference. So remember this. Remember that everyone you meet is carrying a story you cannot see, fighting battles you know nothing about, and your smallest gesture might be the thing that saves them. Show kindness not because it benefits you, but because it defines you. And somewhere, in an office or a home or a heart that needs it, let there be a drawing of hope, a rainbow arching over a simple stick figure family, reminding us all that even in our darkest moments, we are not alone.